On the night of March 22, 1976, Union Station in Washington, D.C. was already slipping into silence. It was just after 11 o'clock, a Monday night, the kind when the city exhales after the last commuters disappear and the echo of footsteps replaces the noise of departure boards. The great terminal, which during the day swallowed tens of thousands of travelers, now belonged to only a handful of night workers and the hum of fluorescent lights. Thomas Brennan had worked this shift for 7 years. He knew the station the way most people know their own homes. He knew which trains ran late, which benches travelers favored, and where forgotten items usually appeared once the crowds thinned out. Most nights were predictable. Empty coffee cups, old newspapers, the occasional umbrella or jacket someone decided wasn't worth carrying any farther. That night felt no different. As Brennan pushed his cleaning cart along the lower concourse near track 17, his eyes scanned the familiar shapes of benches and pillars without much thought. He wasn't looking for anything unusual. Experience had taught him that unusual things almost never happened on the night shift. Then he saw the suitcase. It was sitting upright at the far end of a wooden bench, not tossed aside or shoved under a seat, but placed carefully, almost deliberately. Brown leather, clean lines, brass clasps catching the overhead light. It looked new, expensive, and very much out of place. Abandoned luggage was not rare at Union Station, but this didn't fit the pattern. Most bags that were left behind looked tired, overstuffed, or neglected, as if their owners had already decided they no longer mattered. This one looked like it belonged to someone who cared about it. Brennan stopped his cart and walked over. There was no luggage tag, no name, no destination sticker, no claim ticket tucked into the handle. He waited a moment, scanning the empty concourse, half expecting someone to rush back in a panic. No one did. After several minutes, he followed procedure. The suitcase went onto his cart and up to the Lost and Found office on the mezzanine level, logged like hundreds of forgotten items before it. To Brennan, it was just another object at the end of a long shift.
What he could not have known was that he had just touched the outer edge of one of the most deeply embedded Soviet intelligence operations ever uncovered on American soil. Less than 48 hours later, the contents of that suitcase would redirect the full attention of the FBI's counterintelligence division. Within weeks, it would place half a dozen people under round-the-clock surveillance, and within months, it would unravel a network that had operated quietly, efficiently, and undetected for years. All because one man noticed something that didn't quite belong. At 6 o'clock the following morning, the Lost and Found office reopened. Margaret Chen, who had managed Union Station's lost property for over a decade, began her day the same way she always did, with a ledger, a cup of coffee, and a stack of items waiting to be processed. Among them sat the brown leather suitcase. Chen followed protocol carefully. She logged the item, assigned it a case number, and examined it for identification. The clasps were locked. The leather was unmarked. The craftsmanship stood out immediately. This was not a cheap bag, and it had not been handled carelessly by accident. She noted everything down with precise handwriting. Under normal circumstances, the suitcase would have sat untouched for 30 days before being auctioned or donated. Under normal circumstances, nothing else would have happened. But by Wednesday afternoon, a phone call disrupted that routine. A man contacted Union Station security asking about a brown leather suitcase left near track 17. His description was exact. The color, the material, the brand. Every detail matched the logbook perfectly. Chen told him he could retrieve it, as long as he could come in, show identification, and describe the contents. There was a pause on the line. Then the man said he would come by later that day. He never did. By Thursday morning, the unease had grown strong enough that Chen mentioned the incident to her supervisor. A man who knew exactly what the suitcase looked like, but disappeared the moment verification was required, was not something they saw every day. Station police were contacted. And for the first time since Thomas Brennan lifted the suitcase from that bench, the quiet assumptions of routine were about to collapse.
Because once the locks were forced open, what lay inside made it immediately clear that this was not lost property. It was evidence. And someone, somewhere, was already realizing that a single mistake had set something irreversible in motion. The suitcase was opened on the morning of March 25, 1976, in a small, unremarkable police substation tucked beneath Union Station's lower concourse. There was no dramatic moment, no alarms, no immediate realization of how far this discovery would reach. Just a locked piece of luggage, a set of bent brass clasps, and a decision made quietly between station police and supervisors who felt something was not right. When the lid finally came up, the reaction was instant. This was not personal luggage. Inside the suitcase, everything was arranged with a kind of deliberate order that immediately set it apart from anything lost by an ordinary traveler. There were no clothes, no toiletries, no souvenirs. Instead, there were bundles of cash, neatly stacked and bound with paper bands. There were small notebooks filled with dense handwriting, and there were identification documents, many of them, each bearing a different name, but all of them carried the same photograph. The image showed a middle-aged man with dark hair, a thin mustache, and an unremarkable face, the kind of face that blended into crowds, offices, and commuter trains without leaving an impression, the kind of face that could pass through years of daily life without ever being remembered. To the officers standing over the suitcase, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't theft or fraud, and it certainly wasn't a mistake. It was the kind of preparation that only existed for one purpose. Someone had been carrying a professional identity kit. Within minutes, the Metropolitan Police Department's Detective Division was contacted, and within hours, a phone call reached the FBI's Washington field office. Special Agent Robert Kellerman received that call just after noon. Kellerman had spent more than a decade with the Bureau, the last 5 years focused almost exclusively on counterintelligence. Soviet activity in Washington was not new to him. Diplomats, cultural attachés, trade delegations, journalists, the city was saturated with intelligence officers operating under official cover. But this was different. Lost luggage didn't usually trigger calls to federal authorities, and when a veteran detective said he had found something that didn't feel right, Kellerman listened. He arrived at Union Station less than 20 minutes later. Down a stairwell, past shuttered ticket windows, and through an unmarked door, Kellerman stepped into the police substation. The suitcase sat open on a metal table, its locks broken, its contents exposed under harsh fluorescent light. He didn't touch anything at first. He didn't need to. Years of experience had trained his eyes to recognize patterns before details. Cash, multiple identities, operational notebooks, no personal items, no sentimental objects, no randomness. This was tradecraft, professional, disciplined, and unmistakably Soviet.
Kellerman slipped on latex gloves and began examining the contents carefully. The notebooks were written in Russian, the handwriting small and precise, filled with abbreviations, numbers, and place names. Some were familiar to him immediately: DuPont Circle, Georgetown, Bethesda. Locations tied not to tourism, but to government offices, residential neighborhoods, and known intelligence corridors. The forged documents were of exceptional quality. Driver's licenses from multiple states, birth certificates, social security cards, each one convincing enough to pass routine inspection. Each one tied to a different identity, yet all anchored to the same face. This was not the work of a criminal gang. It was the work of a state. As Kellerman cataloged each item, another detail emerged. Tucked into an interior pocket was a folded piece of paper with a hand-drawn map, 2 streets intersecting, a small X marked at the corner. Beside it, a short notation. To Kellerman, it needed no explanation. This wasn't a note, it was an instruction. By late afternoon, everything had been photographed, logged, and sealed into evidence bags. The suitcase that had spent 2 quiet nights in lost and found storage was now locked in the trunk of an FBI vehicle. As Kellerman drove back to the Washington field office, one thought stayed with him. Whoever owned that suitcase was already compromised. They might not know it yet, but a clock had started ticking the moment the locks were forced open, and the only question now was whether the FBI would reach the end of that clock before its owner realized what had gone wrong. Because somewhere in Washington, a man with an unremarkable face was still living his life, going to work, returning home, and believing that a single careful mistake could be recovered. He was wrong, and the evidence sitting in the trunk of Kellerman's car was about to prove it.
By the morning of March 29, 1976, the suitcase had stopped being an object and become a question. The FBI's Technical Services Division had spent 3 days cataloging every item inside it. The cash totaled just over $9,000. The notebooks, once translated, revealed operational logs written in a mixture of shorthand and plain Russian. Dates, times, locations, patterns that only made sense to someone trained to record information without explaining it. But it was the forged identification documents that finally gave the Bureau a name. One fingerprint, left carelessly on the back of a Maryland driver's license issued to a man named Robert John Morrison, was clear enough to process. It was run through FBI files late Sunday night. On Monday morning, it came back with a match. The fingerprint did not belong to Robert Morrison. It belonged to Walter Stephen Novak. According to Bureau records, Novak was 51 years old. He was a naturalized American citizen, born in Czechoslovakia, who had immigrated to the United States in the early 1950s. He lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, in a modest single-family home he owned outright. He was married, no children, no criminal record, no history of arrests or suspicious activity. On paper, he was invisible. Special Agent Kellerman reviewed Novak's file in his office, page by page, looking for the obvious red flags that usually accompany espionage cases. He found none. Novak had applied for a civil service position in 1962, a job that required fingerprinting and a background check. He had passed. He worked there for several years, then moved into private employment as a translator. His current job was with a small consulting firm in downtown Washington. He paid his taxes, voted, owned a modest home in the suburbs, and blended so completely into routine that no one ever thought to question him. This was exactly what made him dangerous. The most effective intelligence officers were not the ones who stood out. They were the ones who disappeared into routine. They lived lives so carefully ordinary that no one thought to question them. As analysts began reconstructing Novak's past, the gaps emerged slowly, almost reluctantly. There were stretches in his employment history that didn't line up, periods where income was low but expenses never seemed to suffer. Mortgage payments continued. The house was maintained. The lifestyle remained steady. His travel records raised more questions. Between the late 1960s and mid-1970s, Novak had made frequent trips to Canada and Mexico. Short visits, usually 3 to 5 days. No clear business justification, no family connections, no pattern that matched tourism. But there was a pattern. The trips occurred every few months. Not randomly, not impulsively. Scheduled, spaced, deliberate. To Kellerman and his team, the implication was clear. Novak wasn't traveling for himself. He was reporting. The more the FBI examined Novak's life, the more it resembled a structure built to support something hidden. Every detail served a purpose. His language skills, his unremarkable appearance, his stable marriage, his lack of ambition or public profile. He had not built a life, he had been assigned one, and it had worked. For more than 2 decades, Walter Novak had lived inside the United States without attracting serious scrutiny. He had passed background checks, he had worked near government institutions, he had traveled freely, all while maintaining multiple false identities that could be activated when needed. By the end of that week, Kellerman no longer had doubts about what he was looking at. This was not a sympathizer. This was not a part-time source. This was an illegal, a deep-cover intelligence officer operating without diplomatic protection, embedded long-term inside American society, the kind of asset the Soviet Union invested years, sometimes decades, to deploy. And now, because of a fingerprint left on a forged license, that carefully constructed life was beginning to fracture.
On April 2, 1976, the FBI made its decision. They would not arrest Walter Novak, not yet. Instead, they opened a full surveillance operation. Every movement, every meeting, every deviation from routine. The Bureau wanted more than one man. They wanted the network. Because if Novak had been this careful for this long, he was almost certainly not alone. And somewhere beyond his quiet suburban routine, someone else was expecting information he had not yet delivered. It was no longer a matter of if Novak would make contact again. It was only a matter of time. For the first 3 weeks of April, Walter Novak did nothing wrong. That was what made the waiting so difficult. From the outside, his life unfolded with mechanical regularity. He left his house in Silver Spring at the same time every morning. He drove the same route into Washington. He parked in the same garage. He ate lunch at the same small deli near his office. In the evenings, he returned home, watered his lawn, read the newspaper, and watched television with his wife. The FBI watched all of it. Teams rotated in 8-hour shifts. Vehicles changed positions. Foot surveillance blended into commuter traffic. Photographs were taken. Notes were logged. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was forced. And nothing happened. For Kellerman, that was the most dangerous phase of any counterintelligence operation. An agent who knows he has been compromised will disappear quickly. He will abandon routines, destroy materials, and cut contact with handlers. But an agent who believes everything is still under control will continue operating exactly as trained. The Bureau needed Novak to believe he was safe. Then, on the evening of April 23, 1976, Novak broke pattern. At 6:45 p.m., he left his house carrying a brown paper shopping bag. Instead of turning towards his usual routes, he drove north, deeper into Montgomery County. Surveillance vehicles followed at a distance, careful not to crowd him or repeat positions.
35 minutes later, Novak parked near Rock Creek Regional Park. He exited the car alone and entered the park on foot. 2 agents followed, keeping far enough back to remain invisible in the fading light. Novak walked with purpose, not hesitation. He stayed on the jogging trail, then veered off towards a specific tree, one that stood just far enough from the path to avoid casual attention. The tree had a thin band of white paint around its trunk. Novak approached it, glanced around briefly, and placed the shopping bag at its base, tucking it behind exposed roots. The entire action took less than 30 seconds. Then he turned and walked away. To the agents watching, there was no ambiguity. This was a dead drop, one of the oldest techniques in intelligence tradecraft. No direct contact, no conversation, no exchange. Just a location known to both sides and a transfer made without words. The surveillance team did not move in. That was the gamble. Retrieving the bag immediately would confirm Novak's role, but it would also end the trail. Whoever was meant to collect it would vanish. The network would collapse inward, protecting itself. Instead, Kellerman made the call to wait. Agents repositioned themselves around the park. Cameras were trained on the marked tree. Others took positions along nearby streets, watching for anyone who approached on foot or by car. The hours stretched. 8 o'clock passed, then 9. Joggers thinned out, and the park slowly grew quiet. By 11, it was nearly deserted. The surveillance team stayed in place, cold and uncomfortable, eyes fixed on a single patch of ground. At 12:57 a.m., movement appeared on the trail. A man emerged from the darkness, dressed in dark clothing, a basketball cap pulled low. He walked confidently, without hesitation, directly towards the marked tree. He did not look around excessively. He did not carry a flashlight. He knew exactly where he was going. He bent down, retrieved the shopping bag, and walked back towards a residential street where a sedan was parked. Cameras clicked softly. License plates were recorded. The man was followed. He drove south, crossing into Withinia, and eventually parked outside an apartment building in Arlington. He exited the car, carried the bag inside, and disappeared behind a door on the ground floor. By morning, the FBI had his name, Yuri Petrov, a Soviet national. Officially a third secretary at the Soviet embassy in Washington. Unofficially, almost certainly an intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. This was the connection Kellerman had been waiting for. Novak was not freelancing. He was not acting alone. He was being handled by Soviet intelligence, passing materials through classic tradecraft methods that had survived decades of counterintelligence advances. The implications were immediate. If Novak had a handler, then Novak had a purpose. And if Novak had a purpose, then others might be feeding information into the same channel. The Bureau now faced a decision even more dangerous than the first. Arrest Novak and shut down an active Soviet operation, or continue watching, knowing that every day of delay risked further damage to national security. They chose to wait. Because this was no longer about one man. It was about finding everyone who trusted him.
Once Yuri Petrov was identified, the investigation changed character. Until that moment, the FBI had been chasing a man. Now, they were tracing a system. Surveillance on Walter Novak intensified, but it remained invisible. He was followed more closely, his meetings photographed, his phone calls monitored under corp authorization. The goal was no longer to confirm guilt. That had already been established. The goal was to understand scope. Who trusted Novak? Who depended on him? Who would collapse if he disappeared? Over the next 3 months, the Bureau watched patiently as the network revealed itself piece by piece. The first additional contact emerged in early May. Novak met a man named Carl Jensen at a coffee shop on K Street Northwest. They spoke briefly, sat apart, and left separately. It happened again the following week, and again after that. Jensen was an analyst at the Department of Defense, working in a division that assessed military budgets and long-term planning. A background check uncovered significant gambling debts. Bank records showed cash deposits that did not match his salary. The second contact appeared later that month. Catherine Brennan, a researcher specializing in nuclear policy, met Novak inside the Library of Congress. She had no security clearance, but her work placed her close to sensitive discussions and unpublished analysis that would have been valuable to Soviet planners. She had traveled to Canada twice in the previous year, so had Novak. The pattern was forming. By mid-June, the list had grown. Dorothy Walsh, an administrative secretary at the State Department, was observed meeting Novak in a Georgetown park. She processed diplomatic cables. She handled correspondence that passed through restricted channels. Financial records showed purchases well beyond what her income could explain. The final name disturbed investigators the most. Michael DeVoe, a freelance journalist who covered intelligence and national security. He had sources across Washington. He asked the right questions. He knew where to look.
and he met Novak 3 times in less than a month. To the FBI, it suggested something more sophisticated than simple document theft. It suggested influence. By early July, the picture was complete. 5 Americans, 1 deep-cover illegal, 1 Soviet handler operating under diplomatic protection, a flow of information that moved quietly, efficiently, and without ever drawing attention. This was no longer an investigation. It was a countdown.
On July 14, 1976, the FBI moved. At 6:30 in the morning, Special Agent Kellerman stood outside Walter Novak's home in Silver Spring with an arrest team. They knocked once. Novak answered the door in his bathrobe. Kellerman identified himself and placed him under arrest for espionage. Novak did not resist or ask questions. He simply looked at Kellerman with an expression that suggested he had always known this day would come. Across the Washington metropolitan area, other teams moved simultaneously. Jensen was arrested at his home. Brennan was taken into custody as she arrived at work. Walsh was arrested inside the State Department building. DeVoe was arrested at a restaurant where he was eating breakfast. By 7:30 a.m., the network was finished. The decision to wait had paid off. Novak later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He served 14 before being released in a prisoner exchange as the Cold War itself was beginning to collapse. The others received sentences ranging from 8 to 18 years. Yuri Petrov, protected by diplomatic immunity, was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. He returned to Moscow, his role never officially acknowledged. Thomas Brennan never knew the names involved. He never saw the files, the arrests, or the sentences that followed. To him, it was just another night shift and another forgotten suitcase. And that was exactly why it worked. The brown leather suitcase was archived as evidence. Inside the FBI, the case became a teaching tool, studied by generations of counterintelligence officers. Not because it revealed new technology or revolutionary methods, but because it illustrated something far more enduring. Even the most disciplined intelligence operation can be undone by a single mistake, a moment of inattention, a misplaced object, a routine broken at exactly the wrong time. In the shadowed world of espionage, where secrecy is currency and patience is doctrine, sometimes history turns not on grand strategy, but on the smallest human error. In March of 1976, that error was made, and the consequences followed.